In the history of Western art, there are many great artists whose work we know well, but also many whose lives remain shrouded in uncertainty. One such artist was active in the Netherlands and was, undeniably, a genius. But that is virtually all we know about him. We know nothing of where he was born, his background, or his earliest years. Not one letter or document by his own hand has survived. To tell his story, we must rely almost exclusively on his unique works of art. It is only through these paintings and drawings that we can appreciate the life of Pieter Bruegel. In the early 20th century, the advent of color printing enabled the paintings of Bruegel to command the attention of a huge new audience. As a result, his scenes of Flemish peasant life are now amongst the best-known images of 16th century art. But there is far more to the work of Pieter Bruegel than these genre scenes of everyday life. His artistic legacy is diverse and full of striking contrasts. His images of peasant frivolity are deservedly famous today, but his art also addressed darker aspects of human behavior. Many of Bruegel's images are light and amusing, but his humor was often keenly edged with satire. There can be no doubting his mastery at depicting human activity, but his achievements as a landscapist were also substantial. And though it is his paintings for which he is best known today, it was his published drawings that impressed most in his own lifetime. We must look at all aspects of Bruegel's art if we are to fully appreciate his genius.
It's very difficult to think of Bruegel simply as a sort of Brouwer of his day, interested in peasants vomiting and dropping their trousers in the corner and so on. There is so much in his work that suggests a profound seriousness. I find myself standing in front of the Red Calvary in Vienna, absolutely torn by it. More so than in some great Italian Renaissance paintings or some great 17th century Spanish paintings, much more aware of the pain.
All his paintings, and especially the peasant paintings, have got so many different meanings in them, and they're still universal even for us nowadays, and they depict the entertainment and the hardships and so of people, so we can still relate to them nowadays.
The people for whom these pictures were designed were classically educated, so they would have made reference in looking at Bruegel's images to classical writers on the countryside, for example, or Pliny the Elder's chapters on the history of art, where Pieter Bruegel was compared to classical painters. They would have known and been interested in from a kind of nascently nationalistic perspective in the vernacular tradition of Netherlandish proverbs, for example, and they would have come wanting to talk about these things and looking for that kind of textually based significance.
Bruegel was born in the Netherlands during the 1520s, but that is all we know for certain. His parentage is unknown, and his earliest years are a complete mystery. But by the year 1550, his destiny as an artist must have been already clear. Bruegel's only biographer, Karel van Mander, claims that he trained with the well-known painter Pieter Koeke, a resident of Antwerp. Although Bruegel and Koeke were definitely acquainted, we cannot be sure of Bruegel's residency in Antwerp before 1551, when he became a member of the city's Guild of Painters. But no works of any kind survive from these early years of Bruegel's life, and determining his early artistic influences remains a challenge to this day.
The influences on him were probably by people who painted proverbs and folklore, people like Erzen and Baltens. And there was also a school of so-called canvas paintings in Malines, and they used that kind of subject matter. And it's very probably that that's what actually influenced him early on in his career.
There's no doubt that Bruegel was aware of Bosch. There are no instances of copying or using material as a direct source to replicate. But in spirit, the kinship is abundantly apparent.
Depictions of battle formations is important to his manner of composition. There were, for example, in Germany, artists like Altdorfer were painting scenes of classical battles, but also contemporary battles, which needed this high viewpoint, this bird's eye viewpoint, to show the configuration of the battalions as they confronted one another. And I think he really used that.
By 1551, Bruegel lived in the then prosperous city Antwerp, but he would not remain there for long. Shortly after his entry into the Artists' Guild, Bruegel headed south on an already well-trodden path for young artists. His destination, Italy. It was already an established tradition for northern artists to finish their education studying the paintings of the Italian masters in cities like Florence, Venice, and Rome itself. And by 1552, Bruegel was following in this tradition. Although we lack precise details of Bruegel's Italian itinerary, some of his earliest surviving images prove that he was already forging his own artistic career. Bruegel's greatest passion was for the physical, natural environment that he encountered on his travels. This would manifest itself in artistic terms, the art of landscape.
There was always a landscape tradition in the Netherlands. You would have the backgrounds of paintings with very detailed landscape. But on the other hand, you could really imagine that somebody coming from the flat Netherlands with huge skies would really be overawed by these gigantic Alps. But also on a more prosaic note, it may very well have been Hieronymus Koch, the printmaker, who actually sent him and who saw the potential in landscape drawings. And he could then make them into prints.
The real development in landscape, of course, took place on the homeward journey. And it is in a sense documented by that wonderful drawing in the collection of the Courtier Institute, which used to belong to Count Ceylon, in which we have an alpine landscape with an artist sitting with a pad on his knee, and a little hunched figure in the landscape, quite clearly drawing in the open air. Now, I do not believe that he was the first to sit down with a pad on his knee and draw in the open air, but he was certainly one of the greatest.
He was quite self-conscious about their connotations of Netherlandishness, so that he's identifying himself as a Netherlandish artist, and he is attempting, if you like, to figure the profound ideas and the elevated ideas which were expressed in Italian art through classical allegory and history painting, through the art of landscape. I think it's a self-conscious reaction to the challenge of Italianate, ideal kinds of painting.
During his trip to Italy, Bruegel was captivated by the great peaks of the Alps. When he returned to Antwerp around 1554, he began to make landscape drawings in ink, inspired by his mountain experiences. Biographer Karel van Mander described Bruegel as having swallowed the mountains and cliffs so that he could spit them out again afterwards in his studio. It was an unusual passion for the time, and the landscape drawings that resulted were unlike anything seen before. Bruegel was soon to adopt a similar approach to painting. Bruegel's earliest surviving canvases reveal his love of mountain scenes. In Landscape with the Parable of the Sower, the cold, craggy peaks of the background contrast dramatically with the warm rusticity of the left foreground, where we see the sower described in Christ's parable. The diagonal of the river flowing into sunlit open sea makes this a satisfying and unified scene, with Jesus and his followers almost dismissively small in comparison to the grand sweep of nature.
Looking at landscapes by Bruegel, he wants the landscapes to be dominant and the human figures are integrated into them. So that's quite different from earlier artists who would have the figures dominant. And it shows that somehow human figures are probably one with landscape, and the landscape is the main aspect, and it dictates human life.
Perhaps Bruegel intended to convey a sense of the true proportion of man. This is also possible with The Flight of Icarus, the artist's only known mythological work. This is a depiction of the legendary fate of Icarus, the young man who flew too close to the sun. But at first glance, the doomed youth can hardly be noticed. Again, the message here may be the limits of the significance of man, but Bruegel surely has another objective. The young man's final struggle for life is almost comic, a device which highlights the folly of his actions and, more broadly, the folly of man as a whole. This was a subject which Bruegel had already addressed. Around 1558, by the time this canvas was painted, Bruegel had become established in Antwerp, and his drawings were published regularly by a fellow citizen and friend, Hieronymus Koch. One of these published drawings was Big Fish Eating the Little Fish, a clearly satirical comment on human folly inspired by a contemporary proverb. But when this image was first published, it was not presented to the public as Bruegel's work. Instead, his publisher marketed the print as the creation of an earlier Dutch master, an artist whose influence was at its peak in the Netherlands of the mid-16th century, and whose example would repeatedly inform the work of Peter Bruegel. His name was Hieronymus Bosch.
Hieronymus Koch asked Bruegel to do designs in the style of Bosch. So he did large fish eating the small, and the 7 deadly sins. And he was really called the second Bosch at the time.
The influence of Bosch on Bruegel's drawings was both stylistic and thematic. Bosch's work typically imparted a satirical message through crowded, detailed images which exposed the foolishness of his fellow men. Published Bruegel drawings followed his example in images such as The Ass in the School and The Alchemist, which depicts a father and husband oblivious to the hunger of his family as he pursues his futile pseudo-science. It is a typically Boschian image, and in 1557, Bruegel again took inspiration from his Dutch predecessor with a series of drawings depicting the 7 vices of man. Bosch had addressed this enduring theme some 80 years previously with his famous painted tabletop, The 7 Deadly Sins. Now Peter Bruegel took on the same subject matter with masterful effect, creating an allegorical condemnation of sin, whose meaning is still clear today. Symbolism is evident here, with the huge clock in the drawing depicting sloth or idleness. Time marches relentlessly on, as the languid human figures squander their time without even a sense of superficial happiness to show for it. It is typical of the Vices series as a whole, which stands with Bosch's as a great visual expression of the consequences of sin.
In the Seven Vices, Bruegel uses the monstrous creations that Bosch usually uses in The Last Judgment and Temptation of St. Anthony. In the Seven Deadly Sins, Bosch himself is fairly down to earth, and the sins have actually been compared to genre paintings. But on the other hand, if we do compare the phantoms and monsters and devilish creatures of the two artists, then what is noticeable is that Bruegel has much more humorous depictions and depicts the folly rather than the evil of humankind.
The drawing depicting avarice from Bruegel's Vices series gives another example of the artist's satirical approach and the influence he drew from Bosch. Here, a young woman sits surrounded by money as the consequences of the love of money rage all around her. By now, drawings such as this had gained Bruegel the nickname of the Second Bosch. This view of Bruegel can only have been enhanced by a series of panels created by him at the end of the 1550s. 3 works that mark the beginning of his greatness as a painter. With children's games, we again see the influences of Bosch in composition and theme. At first glance, this is just a crowded image of children playing games in a city square. Dozens of contemporary pastimes are illustrated, many of which still give pleasure to children today. But there is a curious joylessness about this apparently carefree scene. A huge amount of energy is being expended. The children pursue their activities with an almost unsettling vigor, but with no seeming benefit deriving from their actions. Bruegel is using the children's games symbolically. We can see them as representative of all those adult activities which seem so important and time-consuming to those engaged in them, but which are ultimately devoid of value or meaning. It is a symbolism that has lost none of its power over 450 years. This panel, from 1559, also conveys a sense of dysfunctional human activity. This is Netherlands Proverbs, a visual depiction of over 100 popular contemporary sayings. Proverbs were especially popular at the time, and the great Dutch humanist Erasmus had published a book listing over 800 of them, many of which are now impossibly obscure in meaning. The same is true of many of the sayings depicted by Bruegel. Few modern viewers can be previously aware that the act of fixing a beard to Christ's chin indicates a lack of monastic faith, or that the blue cloak being fitted to this man reveals the unfaithfulness of his wife. Some prior knowledge is also needed to fully appreciate the many subtleties of Carnival versus Lent, also from 1559, though the immediate message is clear enough. The left of the panel depicts the indulgent spirit of Carnival, the immediate pleasures of the body and the senses. Against this, on the right, the spirit of Lent, the virtues of abstinence, and the permanence of the spirit. Bruegel personifies these opposing spirits at the front centre of the panel, presenting Carnival and Lent giving battle with each other. As we might expect, Carnival is a ludicrous, bloated figure brandishing a huge spit as he sits on an enormous barrel. But this is no simple condemnation of indulgence. Lent is hardly an attractive image either, and her followers fail to make a persuasive case for sobriety and abstinence. There is sense of balance between the two sides, a recognition that, in any disagreement, folly is never the exclusive preserve of one side alone, another message that remains relevant today. Bruegel's even-handedness can also be seen in his Virtues drawings, which formed a companion series to the Vices. Here, in the drawing depicting Hope, the fisherman is clearly concerned with his own hopes. Like all fishermen, he is hoping for a catch. But it is surely ridiculous for such a hope to manifest itself in activity when such a huge storm is raging. As a rule, hope may be a virtue, but not in all circumstances. It would be fascinating to discover what Bruegel's actual thoughts were concerning the activities of his fellow men, but they may have to remain the stuff of guesswork. We cannot even be sure what his religious beliefs were at a time when Christianity was undergoing a great process of change. Not one letter or document containing his own words has survived, and we have to rely on his work when considering what his views might have been. By the late 1550s, however, Bruegel was a well-known citizen of Antwerp, primarily as a result of his published drawings. There can have been few better places for him to live. At the time, Antwerp was a prosperous and cultural city. Bruegel was just one of hundreds of professional artists who made their living there.
Mid-16th century Antwerp was a metropolis, and it was a teeming metropolis. It was called a Koopstad, that is a market city. And it was an amazing place. Probably, people hadn't seen anything like it. It's difficult to imagine it now when you go to Antwerp because it's kind of sleepy as a city. But it was filled with a vast number of different kinds of people from all over the world and from all over Europe.
It had musicians, it had poets, it had writers, it had printers, it had everything that made it a great city. It was probably busier than London, which was a capital city, and Antwerp was not. And that tradition continued well into the 17th century. Rubens had every reason to go and live there in the 17th century because it was the art market of the world, as it were. So, Bruegel couldn't have been better placed.
In 1563, Antwerp was the finest artistic centre of the Netherlands, and Bruegel was one of its high achievers. But 1563 was a year of change for Bruegel. In the spring, he was married to Mayken Köcker, daughter of Peter. The man was almost certainly his old tutor. Bruegel's biographer, Karel van Mander, describes how the marriage was forced upon the artist by his mother, who was apparently keen to end his existing relationship with a servant girl. Following his marriage to Mayken Köcker, Bruegel left Antwerp for Brussels, where he would remain for the rest of his life. Bruegel's art was also undergoing a process of change around this time. 3 panels survive from 1562, which reveal a conscious new approach to technique and subject matter. Many of Bruegel's paintings and drawings had already included disturbing details of torment and suffering in the manner of Bosch. Now, these elements became dominant. The Triumph of Death is a panel that lives up to his title. Here we can see a rampaging army of the dead, against which all living beings are doomed. On the desolate hills, the executioners are busy with their work, while the far background is a fiery scene of hell, reminiscent of the most nightmarish visions of Bosch. We can also see Bosch's influence in Mad Meg, another 1562 panel which shows a terrifying old hag derived from Dutch folk tradition. The fires and monsters indicate that this is a scene of hell itself, in which the dreadful central character is actually in the process of plundering. She cannot be resisted, even by Satan himself, here represented in the form of a bizarre and indeterminate fish-like being that is far more disturbing than any attempt to present the devil in human form. This is, perhaps, Bruegel's most Boschian image, along with Fall of the Rebel Angels, also completed in 1562. Here, animal forms contribute to the overall sense of horror, as the legions of Lucifer meet a terrible fate at the hands of St. Michael's army. It remains one of Bruegel's most striking works, an image of distinctive colour hues and balanced figure arrangement from the brush of an already great artist.
We think of Bruegel as a painter with a wonderful command of aerial perspective, which indeed he became. But the earlier pictures, like De la Grite and The Fall of the Rebel Angels, this sense of space is absent.
I think the most striking thing about these two pictures is the way in which your eye is encouraged to kind of explore or dart about the picture. And you don't immediately see what's going on. There is one dominant figure, Mad Meg, in her picture, which is a kind of satire on women, as far as one can tell. And in The Fall of the Rebel Angels, there are two major figures, but they are, in a sense, large-scale focuses within a kind of chaos, really.
It is a feature of Bruegel's career that his work can be divided into groups of images with a similarity of theme, attitude and execution. The three Boschian panels of 1562 are one such group. So too are the intensely spiritual grisaille images that he created after his move to Brussels. The Death of the Virgin is an example of this series of works, as is this small panel showing the gospel story of the adulterous woman condemned to death by stoning. Christ, of course, accepts the cruel judgment of the law, but argues that only he that is without sin can rightfully cast the first stone. The would-be executioners realize the message of Christ's words, and the woman is saved from her fate. Bruegel's version of the story is undoubtedly profound, but the figure of the woman is also significant in artistic terms. Her form reveals that Bruegel was prepared to look further than Bosch for his inspiration, though not necessarily in terms of physical distance. When Bosch lived in Brussels, a series of cartoons were also located there, intended as the designs for a series of tapestries. They were created several decades previously by one of the greatest of all the Florentine Renaissance masters, And this Bruegel panel shows clearly that the Dutch artist was well aware of the work of his great Italian predecessor, Raphael.
Bruegel was very much influenced by the work of Raphael in The Woman Taken in Adultery, which is seen mainly in the recession of the figures, which create a line of space. And the woman herself is in Italian dress, and she stands in a contrapposto pose, which is very Italianate.
And the woman herself seems to me to be much closer in her general sort of doll-like prettiness to Parmigianino rather than Raphael. Whether he could have known a Parmigianino is another matter. I quite certainly knew the Raphael, so it's easier to say that Raphael lies behind Raphael. Parmigianino was working in Rome in the later 1520s, so one has to sort of investigate the possibilities. I think the best that one can say is that this is quite clearly a picture which has a very strong Italian influence in it.
Images like this reveal that Bruegel was undoubtedly a man of strong Christian faith, and much of his finest work of the mid-1560s was inspired by biblical sources. This included two definitive depictions of the Tower of Babel, as described in the book of Genesis. Here we can see the efforts expended by the builders of the tower. The architecture and engineering is precise and premeditated, and the artist captures the detail masterfully. But the Bible also says that the building of the Tower of Babel was ultimately a pointless exercise that succeeded only in angering the God Jehovah. It was a true folly in the modern architectural sense, an entirely appropriate subject for Bruegel's brush. Bruegel was also keen to take his subject matter from the New Testament. Here we see Christ carrying the cross, a grim biblical event also depicted by Bosch earlier in the century. But at first glance, the Christian significance of the panel may not be obvious. The figure of Christ is insignificantly small in comparison with the grand sweep of the landscape and the swarming of the crowds. Perhaps it is these individuals who are the real subject matter here, especially as they are dressed in the clothing of Bruegel's own time and set against an undoubtedly contemporary landscape. This was a feature of Bruegel's religious work, as can be seen in The Census at Bethlehem, painted in 1566. If we were unfamiliar with the story of the Nativity, we might consider this to be simply a depiction of a chilly winter's day in an ordinary Dutch town of the 16th century.
The Census at Bethlehem, like many other paintings by Bruegel, takes place in a Bethlehem which is a village of his own day, using peasants of his own day in the costume of the day. So, this is not an aberration. This is the custom of the time. It would have been an enormous break from tradition if he had done the census in any other way, if he'd tried to imagine what Arab or Jewish costumes looked like 1,500 years before. And he would have failed.
By setting things in contemporary dress, he brings home the truth of these distant texts like the Bible. He makes them absolutely vivid and present to his audience. But he's doing it in different ways, in a way in all of his, I would say all or almost all of his work. The allegory is there, but it's kind of, the veneer of the allegory isn't classical allegorical language, but vernacular language and contemporary vernacular truth.
This was not the only snowy image created by Bruegel, but with this panel, Hunters in the Snow, there is no need to search for any biblical message. Here, it is the scene that is everything. for this is one of a series of panels created by Bruegel in 1565. Collectively entitled The Months, the artist depicted the different activities and the different environments of the passing seasons. With this calendar of scenes, Bruegel followed in a well-established tradition of Northern European art and made his own memorable contribution to it.
We don't actually know whether there were intended to be, or indeed were, 12 of those paintings, or whether there were six each representing 2 months.
The tradition of the months goes back to calendar illustrations in books of hours. And probably the more precise predecessors to Bruegel would have been manuscripts made in Bruges and Ghent at the beginning of the 16th century. But the big difference is that there you would have had the figures quite large and dominant, whereas with Bruegel you get this wonderful landscape, the figures integrated into the landscape, and the atmospheric conditions of the seasons being depicted and the whole atmosphere.
They are absolutely convincing as something wonderful, mysterious, and like theatre scenery. They hold us in awe.
Only 5 of Bruegel's months paintings survive today, but they contribute greatly to his reputation as a master of genre painting. The months panels provide an enduring visual record of the tasks of the peasantry throughout the year. The gloomy day represents February, a time for pruning trees and gathering twigs. By contrast, August is the time for harvesting, and Bruegel's painting shows the rural workforce both working and resting after their arduous labour in the fields. When we come to examine the visual rendition of the previous month, showing the rural workforce busy making hay in July, we are left in no doubt that the labours of the peasantry are determined by nature. This impression, enhanced by the overwhelming landscape, characterises the months series. But in artistic terms, the image of the Hunters of January remains the most memorable of these genre scenes. Again, we do not need to look for messages below the surface of this wonderfully calm and unified painting. Instead, we can simply appreciate a scene of 16th century life set against a winter landscape, the work of an artist who is now a master of the technical difficulties of compositional layout.
I think The Hunters in the Snow is an unforgettable painting, and in that sense, it's a great painting because it is, once you've seen it, it's really, really hard to forget it. And when I'm thinking about it, what I remember is the economy of means in terms of colour that Bruegel uses, so that he's really restricting his palette to black and white and then some tonal sort of greys and browns, but then with a few splashes of intense reds and so on. So it kind of sets up the notion of Christmas scenes forever and ever, I think, for people. So that wonderful deployment of a restricted palette, I think, is very important about it.
If you want to take one single picture as an example of how threatening and mysterious and moody Bruegel could be with a painting, then The Hunters in the Snow is, I think, as good as any. It's essentially a black and white picture. It's austere, it's threatening, it's hostile. You feel the cold when you look at that picture. You feel that darkness is not far away. And although pleasurable, frivolous things are happening in the middle distance, there is something about the nature of the hunters which has a much larger significance than simply a man out to trap or catch or shoot something. That is there, that's on the surface, but underneath it there is a kind of subtlety which is very telling, perhaps even more telling because it uses the everyday in order to imply the real meaning.
By the time Bruegel painted this timeless image, he had reached the peak of his powers and was well on the way to establishing himself as the definitive painter of Dutch peasant life. Even now, he is sometimes referred to as Peasant Bruegel. But as we have seen, he was actually a city dweller, and certainly not an ignorant man. His known friendships with intellectuals, such as the geographer Abraham Mortelius, testify to this. But there is no doubt that Bruegel's most famous paintings are of peasant recreation scenes. The Peasant Dance is one of these remarkable works, a depiction of the common people engaged in feasting and drinking. The artist's established preoccupation with the folly of man may very well have inspired his choice of subject matter, but, once again, it may be inappropriate to search too hard for hidden meanings behind the image. Perhaps we should simply admire Bruegel's mastery of depicting the solidity of the human form and, more importantly, the sense of dynamism and movement that he now incorporated into his work.
Well, in the Peasant Dance in Vienna, the movement is created mainly through diagonals. You have the dancing couple in the foreground, rush into the painting from the side to join the others. And I suppose a lot of the other movement is created through different gestures in the painting.
In these late works, he integrates the monumental with, if you like, the crowd scene in a much more successful way than in something like Doelgriet, where you've got a sort of discrepancy of scale, massive discrepancy of scale between Doelgriet herself and then, the little figures around the place. And he's obviously been kind of grappling with that artistic problem through his oeuvre. So you've got figures that are more or less on the same scale. And what he uses is, in the compositions, is big kind of unifying forces through the composition, made of colour and made of the rhythmic placement and of colour across the composition to make your eye make the movements that he wants you to see in the picture, so that when you look at the Peasant Dance, through the placement of colour and through the rhythmic echoes across between figures and connections between figures, he actually makes you dance.
For me, it doesn't work. It's a picture which is full of effort. It's almost as though he had drawn a line and established a scheme of linear single-point disappearing perspective, and had then slotted things into it. And the great glumping figures on the right of the picture as they move in, they're not anchored to the ground. Their space relationship to the figures on the left is uncomfortable, slightly wrong height. Everything's amiss. To me, it is the least accomplished, the least atmospheric compositions. It simply doesn't work.
Movement is also the dominant feature of The Wedding Dance, an even more crowded and swirling composition of colour and indulgent abandon. We do not have to look hard to see the effects of the revelry taking place here. Clearly, this is not a homage to pious sobriety. But it is difficult for the modern viewer to do anything but share in the ordinary pleasures of these ordinary people. The same is true when considering The Wedding Banquet, probably the most famous image of Bruegel's entire career. This immaculately arranged panel presents us with a large group of peasants whose priorities for the day ahead are clearly drink, food, and music. In short, an isolated day of fun in a life whose hard labours we have already witnessed in other rural canvases. Bruegel was deeply suspicious of the self-consciously virtuous and understood the universal human need of occasional indulgences. This may explain why paintings like these remain so popular today.
They have their uses, these pictures, in that they record something which otherwise we might have lost. But as for being great paintings in themselves, I think that's pushing the argument for greatness a bit far.
Bruegel's great peasant scenes demonstrate his technical abilities in depicting large numbers of human beings together. But their completion was followed by another change in the artist's approach. If we look at The Land of Cockaigne, we see a trademark Bruegel subject, a Dutch poem describing a fictional land of perpetual plenty, to which entry can only be secured by eating a tunnel through 3 miles of porridge. In the background, we can see a man on the point of completing this epic journey of gluttony. But it is the 3 established residents of Cockaigne that are more important artistically. Bruegel now began to emphasize individual figures in his paintings, far more than at any point in his career. His peasant feast scenes had already revealed a new interest in expressing a greater degree of individual personality. Bruegel chose to put individual figures at center stage, as with The Peasant and Bird Nester of 1568, and the mysterious Misanthrope from the same year. Once again, Bruegel showed his willingness to pursue new directions in his work. By the year 1569, Bruegel had mastered his art. He was still in his early 40s, and years of further achievement surely lay ahead for him. Now settled in Brussels with his wife, 2 sons and a daughter, his work was much sought after by leading private patrons of his day. But tragically, it was not to be. On the 9th of September 1569 in Brussels, Bruegel died. Shortly afterwards, he was buried in the city's church of Notre-Dame de la Chapelle. Typically, we have no idea what the cause of his death was. In the course of a relatively brief working life, Bruegel pursued a unique approach to his work, and the breadth of his achievement was remarkable. His art was still evolving in his final years, and we can only guess at what he might have created had his life not been cut short. But what he did achieve secures the status of Peter Bruegel as one of the greatest of the Dutch masters.